At my housewarming party, my older sister smiled her pageant-winning smile and handed my 7-year-old daughter a bright pink mocktail. "Drink up, sweetheart," she purred. "Jamal and I made this especially for you." I pretended to bend down to fix my daughter's shoe. In one smooth motion, I swapped that pink cup with my brother-in-law's cocktail. Minutes later, the sound of breaking glass and a choked gasp silenced the entire backyard. My name is Madison, 33 years old and a forensic accountant tracking hidden corporate assets. But the biggest fraud I ever uncovered was right in my own family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your child from toxic relatives. Growing up in the wealthy suburbs of Chicago, my sister Penelope, now 35, was the undeniable golden child. She received constant praise, private college tuition, and a lavish country club wedding. I got daily reminders from our parents that I would never measure up. But today was supposed to be my day to shine. I had just closed on a gorgeous $1.2 million home, fully paid for by my own hard work. The backyard was filled with glowing string lights, catered food, and loud laughter. Then Penelope arrived with her husband Jamal. Jamal is a 36-year-old African-American man who works as a highly paid chief financial officer for an investment firm. He stepped onto my stone patio wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit. Penelope immediately began criticizing every detail. She ran her perfectly manicured hand over my pristine outdoor kitchen counter and smirked. "It is cute, Madison," she said loudly. "A bit flashy for a single mother, do you not think? I really hope you did not drain Sophie's trust fund to pay for this little luxury." I smiled tightly. My late grandfather had left my daughter Sophie a $3 million trust fund, and Penelope had been absolutely furious ever since the will was read. She firmly believed the money should have gone to her because she was the oldest and supposedly more responsible. I watched Jamal head toward the outdoor bar, mixing dark rum drinks. Penelope cornered my daughter near the edge of the swimming pool. Sophie was wearing her favorite yellow sundress, looking completely innocent. Penelope knelt down, blocking my view for just a few seconds before turning back around with a clear plastic cup filled with a frothy pink liquid. I walked over quickly just as Penelope shoved the cup toward Sophie's small hands. "Drink up, sweetheart." Penelope said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Jamal and I made this especially for you. It has all your favorite crushed berries inside." I looked down closely at the cup. Something was terribly wrong. A strange white powder had not fully dissolved near the rim, leaving a chalky chemical residue against the pink liquid. My instincts, heavily honed from years of analyzing discrepancies in financial records, screamed that something was off. Sophie reached out eagerly, but I swiftly stepped between them. "Oh, wait, baby, your shoelace is untied," I said, crouching down. I smoothly took the cup from Penelope's hand and set it on the low-glass patio table right next to Jamal's dark rum cocktail. Penelope rolled her eyes and turned away to greet our parents who had just walked through the gate. While her back was turned, I did not hesitate. I slid the pink mocktail behind a potted fern and grabbed a spare cup, filling it with plain fruit punch. Then I poured the spiked mocktail directly into Jamal's rum glass. I handed the safe punch to Sophie and told her to go play inside. Jamal strolled back over to the table, laughing loudly at a joke my father had just made. He picked up his rum glass, unaware of the chalky residue swirling at the bottom. Penelope walked back over, wrapping her arm around Jamal's waist, looking smugly at the empty spot on the table where the mocktail had been. She thought her sinister plan had worked. Jamal raised his glass in a mocking toast to my new house and took a massive, greedy gulp. 10 agonizing seconds passed. Jamal's loud laughter suddenly stopped. He dropped his expensive glass, the heavy crystal shattering across the patio. His large hands flew up to clutch his throat. A horrible, wet, gasping sound tore from his chest as he struggled for air. His eyes rolled back into his head, and his massive frame pitched forward, crashing directly through the lavish wooden charcuterie board. Expensive cheese and ceramic bowls went flying as he hit the hard ground, violently seizing. Screams erupted around the patio. The upbeat pop music created a sickening contrast to the horrific scene unfolding on the stone pavers. Jamal was thrashing wildly, his expensive custom suit tearing against the broken ceramic shards of the charcuterie board. Guests backed away in absolute horror. Someone knocked over a silver tray of champagne flutes, sending more glass shattering across the deck. Years of intense forensic auditing had taught me exactly how to detach my emotions during a high-stakes crisis. I immediately pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed emergency services while rushing toward his convulsing body. Penelope dropped her designer glass and let out a blood-curdling shriek. She threw herself onto the ground next to her husband, but strangely, she did not try to comfort him. She just hovered her manicured hands over his shaking frame, screaming his name over and over in a shrill tone. "Jamal, Jamal, what is happening to you?" Her performance felt theatrical and entirely unnatural. The emergency dispatcher on my phone asked for our location and the nature of the situation. I calmly gave them my new address and stated that a 36-year-old man was experiencing a severe medical episode, likely an allergic reaction combined with an unknown foreign substance. The paramedics arrived in less than 7 minutes, pushing their way through the crowd of my terrified guests. They swiftly rolled Jamal onto a heavy medical stretcher. His face was grotesquely swollen and his lips were tinted a terrifying shade of blue. One of the medics looked directly at Penelope, raising his voice over the chaos. "What did he ingest, ma'am? Does he have any medical conditions or allergies we need to know about right now?" Penelope was sobbing hysterically, clutching her expensive purse tightly against her chest. "I do not know," she cried out. "He just drank some dark rum. He is highly allergic to certain berries, but there was absolutely no fruit in his glass, I swear." I stood back and quietly watched her lie to the medical professionals. She knew exactly what was in that pink mocktail, and she knew her husband had just swallowed a massive dose of it. I kept my mouth firmly shut. I needed to see exactly how far she would take this dangerous deception. The paramedics rushed him to the waiting ambulance, and Penelope jumped into the back with him. I quickly instructed my friends to send the remaining guests home and secure the house. I drove myself to the hospital, my mind rapidly calculating every possible angle of the trap Penelope had just walked into. The emergency room waiting area was freezing cold and smelled strongly of harsh antiseptic cleaner. I sat in a stiff plastic chair for 2 agonizing hours. Penelope paced the faded linoleum floor, glaring fiercely at me every single time she turned around. She had already called our parents, who were currently rushing over from their elite country club dinner. Finally, the swinging double doors pushed open. A tired-looking doctor in green surgical scrubs walked out holding a thick metal clipboard. He looked at Penelope with a grave expression. "Are you the wife of Jamal?" Penelope rushed forward, instantly grabbing the exhausted doctor by the arm. "Yes, that is me. Is he okay? Please tell me my husband is going to survive this nightmare." The doctor sighed heavily and adjusted his glasses. "We have stabilized him for now, but he remains in critical condition. He experienced a very severe anaphylactic shock, likely triggered by a severe fruit allergy. But that is not the most alarming part of his condition. His system is simultaneously shutting down from a massive chemical shock. We pumped his stomach," the doctor continued, "but a significant amount of an unknown, highly potent sedative had already entered his bloodstream. His heart rate dropped to a dangerously low level. If you had called the ambulance even 2 minutes later, he would be dead." Penelope gasped loudly, her hands flying to cover her mouth. But she did not look relieved that he was alive. A dark, frantic panic washed over her face. She slowly turned away from the doctor and locked her eyes directly on me. I saw her decide to spin the narrative. Her fake sadness vanished, replaced by a calculating rage. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You brought dangerous drugs into your house," she shrieked. "You had my 7-year-old niece in a literal drug den. You are a completely unfit mother." She was obviously laying the groundwork to take Sophie and control her trust fund. Before I could dismantle her lie, Penelope pulled out her phone. She hit 3 numbers, glaring at me in absolute triumph. "Yes, hello," she said loudly. "I need to report a crime. My sister just poisoned my husband. I want her arrested for attempted murder." Before the dispatcher on Penelope's phone could even respond, the heavy glass doors of the emergency room slid open violently. My parents rushed into the sterile waiting area, completely ignoring the hospital security guard, who asked them to slow down. My mother, still wearing her expensive silk evening gown from their elite country club dinner, looked utterly frantic. My father trailed closely behind her, carrying her designer cashmere wrap, looking entirely overwhelmed by the late-night disruption. They did not even glance in my direction, not once. My mother bolted straight toward Penelope, wrapping her arms tightly around her weeping golden child. "Oh, my poor sweet girl," my mother cooed, stroking Penelope's hair as if she were a wounded toddler. "What on earth happened to our precious Jamal?" We drove over here as fast as we could. Penelope leaned heavily into our mother's shoulder, pointing a perfectly manicured finger back at me. "It was Madison, Mom." Penelope sobbed loudly, ensuring every single nurse and patient in the waiting room could hear her accusations. She poisoned him. She had dangerous illicit narcotics hidden at her new house, and she maliciously slipped them into his drink because she is jealous of our perfect marriage. My mother slowly turned her head to look at me, her eyes narrowing into cold, intensely judgmental slits. She gently pulled away from Penelope and marched across the faded hospital linoleum floor until she was standing just inches from my face. I could smell the expensive wine on her breath. "I should have known your flashy little housewarming party would end in an absolute disaster," she hissed angrily. "You have always been so utterly reckless, Madison." I stood my ground, keeping my voice completely level, despite the rage building inside my chest. "Mom, you were not even there. You have absolutely no idea what actually happened on that patio. I did not drug anyone." But my mother waved her diamond-ringed hand dismissively, cutting me off before I could defend myself. "Do not lie to me. I see right through this pathetic facade you have built. You buy $1 million house trying to prove you are somehow better than your older sister. But deep down, you are still the same bitter, impulsive girl who cannot even keep a man. Living this reckless lifestyle, throwing wild parties with dangerous drugs lying around. It is completely disgusting. You could have killed your brother-in-law tonight with your sheer negligence." I could clearly see the vicious manipulation taking shape before my eyes. My forensic accounting brain was already connecting the dark data points in real time. Penelope was crying flawlessly on cue. My father was staring blankly at the floor, completely avoiding eye contact. And my mother was actively building a false narrative to destroy my credibility. "What about my innocent granddaughter?" My mother suddenly demanded, her voice rising an octave to grab more attention. "Where is Sophie right now? Is she safe from your toxic and reckless behavior?" I took a slow, deep breath. "Sophie is perfectly safe with my trusted friends at the house, sleeping peacefully. Do not dare bring my daughter into this absurd and dangerous lie." My mother let out a sharp, incredibly cruel laugh that echoed in the quiet hallway. "Oh, I am bringing her into this. If the police are actively involved and illegal drugs were found at your residence, you are legally an unfit mother. I will not let my only granddaughter be raised in a dangerous drug den by an unstable woman. I am calling Child Protective Services first thing in the morning. I will personally tell them everything that happened tonight and strongly petition the family court to have Sophie permanently removed from your custody." My blood ran cold. The threat to take my child away was the ultimate unforgivable escalation. But then my mother took it one step further, finally revealing the ugly, greedy truth that had been brewing since the day my grandfather's will was formally read. She leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a vicious, venomous whisper that only I could hear. "Sophie desperately needs a stable married mother like Penelope. You do not deserve to manage Sophie's $3 million trust fund. You never did. You are irresponsible and dangerous. Once Child Services takes her away, I will make sure the judge appoints Penelope as the sole legal trustee of that massive account. It is the only way to properly protect the family assets." She stepped back, a deeply smug and satisfied smile forming on her lips, as she crossed her arms defensively. The true sickening motive was finally out in the open. They did not care about Jamal fighting for his life in intensive care. They only cared about controlling the $3 million. I stared at the smug expression on my mother's face. The sheer audacity of her plan was breathtaking. She was perfectly willing to use her son-in-law's near-fatal poisoning as a convenient legal loophole to steal my daughter's inheritance. Before I could even formulate a response to her vile threat, the heavy glass doors of the emergency room slid open again. Two uniformed police officers walked inside. Their heavy boots squeaked against the polished linoleum floor. The taller officer, a broad-shouldered man, with a stern expression, scanned the waiting area. Penelope did not miss a single beat. She practically threw herself across the room, rushing toward the officers, with fresh tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "Help me, please," she sobbed, clutching the taller officer's sleeve. "My husband is dying in the intensive care unit, and the woman who did this is standing right there." She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at me. The officers exchanged a quick professional glance before stepping forward. The second officer, a sharp-eyed woman with her notepad already drawn, asked Penelope to slow down and explain exactly what happened. Penelope launched into an absolutely flawless, hysterical performance. She told the officers that I had invited them to my housewarming party solely to show off, and that I had always been deeply jealous of her perfect marriage to Jamal. She claimed I was obsessed with their wealthy lifestyle and harbored a dangerous resentment toward my older sister. Then she delivered the fatal blow. She said she saw me hovering over the drink station just minutes before Jamal collapsed. She swore she saw me drop a handful of pills into his rum glass because I wanted to kill him and ruin her life forever. She told the officers she had tried to stop me, but I had aggressively pushed her away. She even added that I laughed coldly when he fell to the ground. The female officer turned to my parents. "And what did you witness, Mom?" My mother stepped right up, smoothing her silk dress, projecting the image of a deeply concerned, respectable grandmother. "Officer, it breaks my heart to say this about my own flesh and blood." My mother began, her voice dripping with fake sorrow. "But my youngest daughter has always been incredibly unstable. She throws these wild, reckless parties. We warned Jamal and Penelope not to attend tonight. Madison has a long history of erratic behavior, and we strongly suspect she keeps illegal narcotics in her home. She is completely unfit to raise a child, and we are petrified she might hurt our 7-year-old granddaughter next." My father, who had barely spoken a word all night, finally chimed in with a solemn nod. "It is true. She is dangerously jealous of her sister. We are terrified for our granddaughter's safety in her custody." 3 corroborating witnesses, 3 family members standing united, painting me as a deranged, jealous, drug-addicted attempted murderer. In the eyes of the law, their unified front looked incredibly damning. They were building an airtight case against me right there in the hospital corridor. I stood completely still. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not try to interrupt them or violently defend myself. In my profession as a forensic accountant, the worst thing you can do when investigating a massive fraud is interrupt the suspects while they are actively spinning their web of lies. You let them talk. You let them build their false reality brick by brick. You let them commit to their perjury on the official police record. Because the higher they build their tower of lies, the harder it shatters when you finally pull the foundation out from under them. I memorized every single lie falling from their lips. The tall officer looked at me. His expression was hard and unforgiving. My unnatural calmness in the face of these severe accusations clearly unnerved him. To him, my lack of hysterical crying probably looked like the cold detachment of a guilty psychopath. He rested his hand casually near his utility belt and took 2 heavy steps toward me. "Mom, I am going to need you to step away from the other hospital guests," he said in a low, authoritative voice. Penelope let out a quiet, satisfied sniffle, burying her face in our mother's shoulder. They thought they had won. They thought I was going to be led out of the emergency room in shiny metal handcuffs, leaving Sophie and her $3 million trust fund completely defenseless. The officer gestured toward a small private consultation room just down the hallway. "We need to ask you some official questions regarding the attempted poisoning of your brother-in-law," he stated flatly. "And before we begin, I am going to read you your Miranda rights. Do you understand me?" I looked directly into my sister's triumphant eyes. I did not flinch. I followed the two officers into the consultation room, the heavy wooden door clicking shut. The muffled sounds of my family's fake crying vanished. The tall officer pointed to a chair, but I chose to stand. He pulled a laminated card from his pocket and recited my Miranda rights in a monotone. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." I listened, keeping my breathing even. When he finished, I gave a firm nod. "I understand completely," I replied smoothly. "I am entirely willing to cooperate. But before you write down a single word of my sister's ridiculous fairy tale, there is hard evidence you must review immediately." The female officer raised an eyebrow, her pen hovering over her notepad. "Are you confessing to the attempted poisoning?" she asked sharply. "Not even close," I said to them. I reached into my leather tote and pulled out my tablet. As a forensic accountant, I deal with extremely sensitive corporate data daily. I recently had a state-of-the-art security system installed around my property. The cameras record in ultra-high-definition 4K resolution, capturing crystal clear video and crisp audio. I unlocked the screen and opened the application, tapping directly into the backyard patio feed from earlier that evening. I slid the tablet across the table. "Watch the timestamp in the bottom right corner," I instructed. On the bright screen, the patio was bathed in warm string lights. The video showed Jamal mixing drinks at the outdoor bar, completely oblivious. Then the camera tracked Penelope. The high-definition footage captured her slipping away from the crowd and creeping over to the drink station. The officers watched in stunned silence as my sister pulled a small baggie from her designer clutch. She extracted a large white pill, placed it on the marble counter, and used the heavy bottom of a rum bottle to crush it into a fine powder. "What is she doing?" the tall officer muttered, his stern demeanor vanishing. "Keep watching," I said coldly. The footage showed Penelope scraping the white powder directly into the bright pink mocktail. The audio feed picked up her voice perfectly as she muttered to herself, making sure the powder dissolved into the fruity liquid. Then the camera caught me walking over. It documented the moment I realized what she was doing. The footage showed me crouching down to tie Sophie's shoe and, in one fluid defensive motion, swapping the poisoned pink mocktail with Jamal's dark rum glass. "I saved my daughter's life," I told the officers, my voice hardening. "My sister intended to drug a 7-year-old child." The female officer let out a sharp breath, her eyes wide. She rewound the video and watched the swap happen a second time. "They just lied to us," she whispered to her partner. "The entire family stood out there and filed a false police report to cover this up." The tall officer's face flushed with anger. "Providing false statements to law enforcement is a serious crime, but attempting to poison a minor is a major felony." He grabbed the tablet. "We need to confiscate this as official evidence." I nodded in agreement. I backed up the files to secure cloud servers. "Do what you need to do." The officers pushed the room door open and marched straight back into the waiting area. I followed closely behind them. Penelope was sitting next to my mother. When she saw me walk out without handcuffs, her smug expression faltered, but then she saw the officers marching aggressively toward her. "Are you taking her away now?" Penelope asked quickly. The tall officer did not answer. Instead, he unclipped the heavy metal handcuffs from his utility belt. "Penelope, you are under arrest for the attempted poisoning of a minor and filing a false police report," he announced loudly. "Turn around immediately." My mother screamed in horror, dropping her purse. "You are arresting the wrong sister," she shrieked. Penelope began backing away, turning pale with genuine terror. "Wait, no, I did not do anything," she stammered, raising her hands defensively. The officer lunged forward, grabbing Penelope's wrist and spinning her around. The metallic click of the first handcuff echoed through the room. My father yelled out, demanding the officer's stop. But just as the second cuff was about to lock into place, the double doors of the intensive care unit burst open. A breathless nurse ran out into the waiting area, her scrub stained and her eyes frantic. "Stop!" the nurse yelled, waving her arms wildly at the police. "Do not arrest her yet. Jamal is awake. He just pulled out his breathing tube, and he is demanding to speak to the police right now." The tall officer immediately released Penelope's wrist, leaving the heavy metal handcuff dangling loosely from her arm. We all rushed down the sterile white hallway, closely following the frantic nurse through the swinging double doors of the intensive care unit. The rhythmic, urgent beeping of the medical monitors filled the cramped room. Jamal was sitting up in his elevated hospital bed. His face was still terribly swollen from the allergic reaction, and angry red hives covered his entire neck, but his eyes were sharp and incredibly alert. For a man who had nearly suffocated to death just an hour ago, he looked remarkably calculating. He was a high-powered chief financial officer, a man who made his living navigating complex corporate loopholes, manipulating boards of directors, and spinning disastrous financial data into good news. As soon as he saw the police officers and Penelope's tear-stained, terrified face, his corporate survival instincts kicked in perfectly. He was already assessing the legal liabilities in the room. The female officer stepped forward, holding her notepad at the ready. "Sir, you really should be resting," she said gently but firmly. "We need to inform you that your wife was just caught on security footage putting an unknown crushed pill into a child's drink. We have strong reason to believe she attempted to poison your 7-year-old niece, and you accidentally ingested the toxic substance instead." Penelope let out a pathetic, trembling whimper from the doorway, looking at Jamal with wide, desperate eyes. She silently pleaded with him to save her from federal prison. Jamal did not even blink. He let out a weak, raspy laugh that sounded completely staged and utterly fake. "Officers, there has been a massive and terrible misunderstanding," he croaked dramatically, rubbing his chest. "That was absolutely not poison. That was my prescription medication for my severe food allergies. I specifically asked Penelope to crush it up and put it in my drink because my throat was feeling tight earlier in the evening. She must have just gotten confused by the dim lighting on the patio and dropped it into the wrong pink cup. It was a simple, honest mistake made by a worried wife." I stared at him in pure, unfiltered disgust. He was lying through his teeth to protect her, instantly creating reasonable doubt for the police. A wife accidentally mixing up plastic cups at a crowded, dimly lit party was a tragic mistake, not a premeditated felony. Without a formal lab test proving otherwise right in that exact moment, the police had no immediate legal grounds to hold her on an attempted murder charge if the supposed victim was actively corroborating her fake story. The tall officer frowned deeply, crossing his arms, clearly frustrated by the sudden change in the narrative. "Are you absolutely sure about this, sir?" the officer asked, his tone heavy with obvious suspicion. "Because the security video footage we just reviewed looks highly incriminating and extremely deliberate." Jamal nodded emphatically, putting on a perfect award-winning display of a forgiving, loving husband. "I am absolutely positive, officer. My wife is a wonderful, caring woman. She would never hurt anyone, especially not a child. Please take those cuffs off her immediately. This is a family matter that got blown way out of proportion." My parents let out a simultaneous sigh of profound relief that echoed loudly in the small hospital room. My mother rushed to the side of the bed, praising God for Jamal's miraculous survival and Penelope's proven innocence. Penelope rubbed her wrist, throwing me a deeply smug, triumphant glare over my mother's shoulder. They thought they had completely outsmarted the legal system and me. They thought they had successfully erased their crimes. But Jamal was not finished. He leaned forward, the monitor wires shifting and tangling across his chest. He locked his dark, furious eyes directly onto me, his expression hardening. The fake warmth completely vanished from his voice, rapidly replaced by a chilling, calculated malice. "But there is a real crime that happened tonight. Jamal stated firmly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. The tall officer paused, his hand resting on his belt. "What do you mean, sir?" Jamal pointed a shaking accusatory finger straight at my face. "My sister-in-law, Madison," he rasped loudly, ensuring the police heard every single syllable. "She is the one who almost killed me. She knows I have a deadly severe allergy to the specific crushed berries used in that pink mocktail. She knew exactly what she was doing tonight. If she swapped the drinks like you said, she maliciously gave me that exact cup to ensure I would consume the fruit that triggers my violent anaphylactic shock. I want to press full criminal charges against her right now for attempted murder." The hospital room fell dead silent after Jamal's explosive accusation. The tall police officer looked from Jamal to me, his jaw clenching in obvious frustration. Because Jamal actively claimed the crushed powder was simply his own prescribed allergy medication, the entire criminal foundation of the attempted poisoning charge against Penelope completely dissolved in the eyes of the law. A wife accidentally dropping her husband's prescription into the wrong cup is not a crime, it is a negligent mistake. But Jamal was now twisting the narrative to claim that I deliberately handed him the toxic cup, knowing his severe fruit allergy would trigger a lethal reaction. The female officer sighed heavily and put her notepad away. "Sir, given the highly conflicting testimonies and the fact that you are actively protecting the individual seen on video tampering with the beverage, we cannot make an immediate arrest tonight," she explained. "This entire case will have to be forwarded to the district attorney's office for a thorough review. They will decide if any criminal charges can be formally filed against either party. Until then, I strongly advise all of you to stay away from each other." My mother immediately wrapped her arms around Penelope, praising the officers for their wisdom. Penelope shot me a sickeningly sweet smile of pure triumph. They had successfully weaponized the legal system to protect the golden child. I did not waste another second breathing the same sterile hospital air as them. I turned on my heel and walked out of the intensive care unit, my mind already running through every possible legal and financial countermeasure. I drove back to my new house, locked every deadbolt, and checked on Sophie. She was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the monstrous greed that had nearly cost her life. For the next 3 days, my phone blew up with hateful text messages from extended family members. My parents had clearly wasted no time spinning the story. According to their new narrative, I was a jealous, unstable sister who had maliciously triggered Jamal's severe allergies to ruin their perfect evening. I ignored every single message. I was a forensic accountant. I knew that engaging with emotional manipulators only gave them ammunition. I needed hard data. On the morning of the 4th day, I was sitting at my pristine kitchen island drinking coffee when a loud knock echoed through the house. I opened the front door to find a man in a plain gray suit holding a thick manila envelope. "Are you Madison?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. He shoved the heavy envelope directly into my hands. "You have been served," he stated flatly, before turning and walking briskly back to his parked car. I closed the heavy wooden door and tore open the envelope. The dense legal jargon jumped off the crisp white pages. It was a formal civil lawsuit filed in the county court. The plaintiff was Jamal. I scanned the massive block of text detailing his completely fabricated version of the events. He was suing me for exactly $1 million in damages for intentional infliction of bodily harm, severe medical trauma, and lost corporate wages. The sheer audacity of the document was staggering. He claimed that my reckless and malicious decision to swap the plastic cups was a deliberate attempt on his life, causing him immense physical suffering and emotional distress. He was using a high-powered civil litigation firm downtown, the kind that charges $1,000 an hour, to bury ordinary people in endless legal paperwork. Jamal knew the criminal charges would likely get bogged down in bureaucratic red tape because of his contradictory testimony. So he was attacking me where he thought I was most vulnerable, my finances. He was trying to drain my resources so I would be too broke to fight my parents in family court when they inevitably filed for custody of Sophie and her $3 million trust fund. He wanted to bleed me dry before the real battle even started. I flipped to the third page of the lawsuit, expecting to find the standard court summons and hearing dates. Instead, my blood ran completely cold. Attached to the lawsuit was a judge's signature on a terrifying legal order. Jamal's high-priced lawyers had successfully filed an ex parte motion, an aggressive legal maneuver done without my prior knowledge or presence in court. Because Jamal claimed I was an unstable flight risk who might hide my assets to avoid paying his massive medical damages, the judge had granted an immediate emergency injunction. I read the bold black text over and over again, feeling a sharp knot form in my stomach. Effective immediately, all of my personal bank accounts, my investment portfolios, and the equity in my brand new $1.2 million home were legally frozen. I could not withdraw a single cent to buy groceries or pay a lawyer. I was completely locked out of my own money. I stared at the heavy legal document in my trembling hands. By freezing my assets, he intended to starve me out completely. He wanted me desperate, utterly unable to mount a proper legal defense, and entirely dependent on the conditional mercy of my family. He severely underestimated the resilience of a woman who spent her career untangling the complex financial webs of ruthless corporate criminals. Before I could call an attorney, a sleek silver Mercedes pulled into my driveway. I recognized it immediately. It was my parents arriving. I opened the heavy front door before they could even ring the brass bell. I did not even invite them inside. I stood firmly in the doorway, blocking their path into my home. My mother was wearing a pristine white tennis outfit, looking entirely unbothered by the fact that she had just helped frame her youngest daughter for a felony. My father stood right behind her, his posture rigid and his expression stern. "Madison, we need to talk," my mother said, using the condescending tone she usually reserved for disobedient children. "I heard you received the legal paperwork from Jamal's attorney this morning. It is an absolute tragedy that things had to escalate to this level, but you really brought this entirely upon yourself." I gripped the doorframe tightly. "You mean the frivolous lawsuit filled with blatant perjury?" I shot back, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "The one where your beloved son-in-law illegally froze my bank accounts to prevent me from fighting back." My father let out a heavy, disappointed sigh and shook his head. "Do not play the victim here, Madison," he scolded harshly. "Jamal spent 3 agonizing days in the intensive care unit because of your reckless actions. Do you have any idea how much those medical bills cost? He is an executive with a flawless reputation to uphold, and the physical trauma you caused is severely impacting his ability to work. You are practically bankrupting him and your sister with these astronomical hospital expenses." It was a laughable lie. A chief financial officer of a major investment firm would have premium top-tier health insurance. The idea that a few days in the hospital would bankrupt him was mathematically absurd. But I knew better than to argue logic with people committed to a dangerous delusion. "We are here to offer you a graceful way out of this terrible mess," my mother continued, clasping her hands together in a grotesque display of fake sympathy. "Jamal is a reasonable man. He is willing to settle this civil lawsuit entirely out of court and drop the emergency injunction if you just do the right thing. You need to put this beautiful house on the market immediately." I stared at her in utter disbelief. "You want me to sell my home to pay off a man who tried to poison my 7-year-old daughter? He did no such thing." My mother snapped her fake sympathetic mask, slipping to reveal the absolute venom underneath. "It was a tragic accident with his allergy medication, and you maliciously handed him the wrong cup. Selling this flashy house to compensate him for his horrible suffering is the Christian thing to do. It is what family does when they make a terrible mistake. You need to humble yourself, Madison. Sell the property, pay Jamal the $1 million he rightfully deserves, and maybe Penelope will find it in her heart to forgive you for trying to destroy her marriage." I looked at the 2 people who were supposed to protect me, realizing they were nothing more than eager accomplices to my destruction. "I will never sell my home," I said with absolute finality. "And I will never pay a single cent to that lying sociopath. You can take your fake Christian charity and get off my property before I call the police and report you for trespassing." I moved to slam the door in their faces, but my father abruptly stepped forward, wedging his expensive leather shoe into the doorframe to force it open. His face was flushed with anger, his eyes cold and devoid of any paternal warmth. "If you want to play hardball with us, you are going to lose absolutely everything," my father growled, leaning in so incredibly close that I could smell the stale black coffee on his breath. Penelope and Jamal have already drafted the formal petition for emergency legal custody of Sophie. And if you stubbornly refuse to sell this house and settle the civil lawsuit today, your mother and I will personally testify against you in family court next week. We will confidently tell the judge, under oath, that you are mentally unstable, entirely unfit to be a mother, and a severe physical danger to that sweet little girl. I did not give my father the satisfaction of seeing my hands shake. I looked him dead in the eye, told him to leave my property, and slammed the heavy oak door shut, locking the deadbolt with a loud, echoing click. I leaned against the cool wood, taking a deep, shuddering breath. They had drawn the battle lines. The physical confrontation was over, but the digital assault was just beginning. By noon the next day, my smartphone began vibrating continuously on the marble kitchen counter. It was a highly synchronized attack from our extended family. Aunt Martha sent a long, venomous paragraph accusing me of being a bitter woman trying to ruin a beautiful marriage. Cousin Jason left a harsh voicemail calling me a psychotic, jealous freak who needed to be locked up in a psychiatric ward. My inbox was rapidly overflowing with absolute vitriol. They had all blindly accepted my parents' twisted version of reality without ever bothering to ask for my side of the story. I was officially the villain of the family, but the private text messages were nothing compared to the public spectacle Penelope had carefully orchestrated. Later that afternoon, a concerned colleague sent me a link to a video Penelope had posted on her public Facebook page. She had dramatically titled it, "Surviving a Toxic Sibling." I hit play and watched my sister deliver an absolute masterclass in manipulation. She was sitting on her plush velvet couch, wearing a simple oversized sweater, her makeup expertly done to make her look exhausted and incredibly pale. She cried softly into a tissue, looking directly into the camera lens. She did not use my exact name, but the implication was crystal clear to anyone who knew us. She talked about the deep, lingering pain of having a family member who harbored dark jealousy. She spoke about the terrifying incident at my party, completely twisting the narrative to make it sound like Jamal was an innocent victim of my malicious envy. She ended the video by asking for prayers for her husband's physical recovery and for her sister's deeply troubled mental health. The video already had hundreds of shares and thousands of comments from our affluent community, all offering their unwavering support to the brave, suffering wife. The fallout from her viral performance bled instantly into my real life. On Monday morning, I drove Sophie to her elementary school. Normally, the morning drop-off lane was a bustling place for quick chats and friendly waves with the other parents. But today, the atmosphere was freezing cold. As I walked Sophie toward the main brick entrance, a group of prominent Parent-Teacher Association mothers were gathered near the crosswalk. They took one look at me and immediately stopped talking. One of them actually grabbed her child hand and pulled him closer, shooting me a look of pure, unfiltered disgust before turning her back completely. Another mother actively stepped out of my path as if I were carrying a contagious disease. I kept my chin high, gave Sophie a tight, loving hug, and watched her walk safely through the heavy school doors. My heart ached immensely for my daughter. My family was actively trying to turn my entire community into a hostile environment, hoping the intense social isolation would finally break my spirit and force me to settle the lawsuit. I drove back to my quiet, empty house. The silence in the hallways was deafening, but it was exactly what I needed to focus. Penelope and my parents were playing a vicious emotional game, banking entirely on public shaming and intense family pressure to force my surrender. But they forgot exactly who they were dealing with. I am a forensic accountant. I do not deal in hurt feelings, neighborhood gossip, or viral social media videos. I deal in hard, undeniable numbers, and numbers absolutely never lie. I walked into my home office, closed the heavy window blinds, and sat down at my large oak desk. I woke up my computer monitors and bypassed the standard login screens, launching my encrypted virtual private network. I logged directly into my secure work server. Jamal claimed his medical bills from a 3-day hospital stay were completely bankrupting him. He claimed he needed my $1 million house to survive. That narrative made zero financial sense for a highly paid chief financial officer at a prominent downtown investment firm. Men like Jamal did not just run out of cash overnight, they hid it. I cracked my knuckles and opened a blank investigative spreadsheet. I started with the basics, bypassing his personal bank accounts that were heavily shielded by his lawyers, and went straight for the public corporate records. I accessed the state business registry and began pulling the quarterly corporate tax filings for his firm. The state business registry was a goldmine of poorly hidden secrets. I pulled the quarterly corporate tax filings for his firm and began running the numbers through my specialized fraud detection software. Jamal was a slick chief financial officer, but he was incredibly arrogant. He assumed nobody in his immediate family possessed the technical skills to audit his complex corporate structures. Within 2 hours, I found the first massive discrepancy. Millions of dollars in corporate revenue were supposedly being funneled into a subsidiary company for operational expenses. But when I traced the routing numbers, that subsidiary did not exist. It was a phantom shell company registered to a post office box in the Cayman Islands. He was bleeding his own investment firm dry to fund a lifestyle he could not afford. But it got substantially worse. I cross-referenced his public tax records with federal databases and discovered a massive glaring red flag. The IRS had recently placed a massive federal tax lien on 2 of his properties. He was not just broke, he was being hunted by the federal government for millions in unpaid back taxes. He was absolutely desperate for liquid cash. As I was downloading the final batch of incriminating ledgers, a notification popped up on my email screen. It was marked urgent and sent directly from the senior partner at the aggressive downtown litigation firm representing Jamal. The subject line read, "Formal Settlement Offer." I clicked open the attached document. It was a 20-page legal contract drafted with the kind of ruthless, predatory language designed to intimidate ordinary people into absolute submission. I read through the dense paragraphs, scanning past the standard legal jargon to find their actual demands. They were not asking for the $1 million. They did not actually care about compensating Jamal for his supposedly immense physical suffering. The entire civil lawsuit, the frozen bank accounts, the emergency injunction on my house, it was all just a heavily manufactured smokescreen for their real objective. Section 4 of the settlement contract laid out the extortion perfectly. Jamal and Penelope offered to completely drop the $1 million civil lawsuit against me. They promised to immediately lift the devastating financial injunction that was holding my house and my bank accounts hostage. They agreed to sign a strict non-disclosure agreement, preventing them from speaking publicly about the party ever again. All I had to do in return was sign one single piece of paper attached to the back of the file, a formal relinquishment of my parental rights. The contract demanded that I legally transfer full permanent guardianship of my 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, over to my sister Penelope. And embedded deep within that guardianship clause was the ultimate prize they had been plotting to steal from the very beginning. By signing over custody of Sophie, I would automatically transfer absolute control of my grandfather's $3 million trust fund directly into Jamal's and Penelope's bank accounts. They wanted to steal my child to pay off the IRS and save themselves from federal prison. The sheer evil of their plan was breathtaking. My own sister was willing to drug a child, frame me for attempted murder, freeze my entire life savings, and tear a mother away from her daughter, all to cover up her husband's massive corporate fraud. A normal person might have completely broken down at this point. A normal person might have collapsed under the crushing weight of this psychological warfare and signed the papers just to make the nightmare stop. But I was not a normal person. I was a professional investigator who systematically destroyed corrupt executives for a living. I pressed the print button on my computer. My heavy-duty office printer roared to life, churning out page after page of undeniable catastrophic financial evidence. Bank statements, hidden offshore routing numbers, IRS tax liens, and fraudulent corporate filings. It took exactly 20 long minutes to completely finish. I gathered the massive 500-page dossier and bound it tightly together in a thick black folder. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct number for my attorney, a man known for being an absolute shark in the courtroom. He answered on the second ring. "I need you to contact Jamal's legal team right now," I instructed, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Tell them I received their disgusting settlement offer. Tell them I am ready to negotiate the terms in person. Set up a formal mediation session at their downtown office for tomorrow morning." My lawyer paused, sensing the cold determination in my tone. "Are we surrendering Madison?" he asked quietly. I looked down at the massive stack of evidence that was about to destroy my sister's existence. "No, I am not even close," I replied. "Let us go hunting." The next morning, I walked into the soaring glass lobby of the most expensive corporate law firm in downtown Chicago. My lawyer walked beside me carrying the thick black folder. We took the private elevator up to the 50th floor. The receptionist guided us into a massive corner conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The long mahogany table gleamed under modern chandelier lighting. It was a room designed specifically to intimidate people into surrendering before they even sat down. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors swung open. Jamal and Penelope walked in, looking like they were stepping onto a red carpet instead of attending a brutal legal mediation. Penelope was wearing a pristine white Chanel blazer and carrying a Birkin bag that cost more than most people's cars. Jamal was dressed in a custom navy Tom Ford suit. For a man who claimed to be suffering from severe medical trauma, he looked remarkably healthy and exceptionally arrogant. My parents trailed right behind them, taking their seats on the far side of the massive table. They were perfectly positioned to act as the supportive witnesses to my supposed downfall. My mother shot me a look of deep disappointment while my father simply crossed his arms and glared. Jamal sat at the head of the table, radiating smug confidence. His attorney, a sharp-featured man named Vance, slapped a thick leather briefcase onto the mahogany surface with a loud thud. Vance did not even bother to introduce himself to my lawyer. He simply popped the brass latches, pulled out the 20-page settlement contract, and dropped it heavily onto the center of the table right in front of me. "Let us make this meeting very quick," Vance said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "My client is a highly respected financial executive who has suffered immense physical and emotional damage due to your reckless behavior. We have the emergency injunction holding your assets. We have 3 credible witnesses ready to testify to your profound mental instability. We hold all the cards, Madison. You are out of money, and you are out of time." Penelope leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and gave me a sickeningly sweet smile. "Just sign the papers, Madison," she said softly. "It is the best thing for Sophie. She needs a stable home with 2 loving parents. You know you cannot give her that right now. We will take wonderful care of her and her trust fund. You can finally get the psychiatric help you so desperately need." My own mother nodded enthusiastically from the back row. "Listen to your sister Madison," my mother urged. "She is throwing you a lifeline. Take it before you end up in a jail cell." Vance did not wait for my response. He aggressively slid the thick contract across the smooth wood along with a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. The pen stopped exactly an inch from my right hand. "Sign the relinquishment of guardianship," Vance demanded, tapping his finger on the signature line. "If you sign right now, we drop the $1 million lawsuit and we lift the freeze on your bank accounts by noon. If you refuse, we will bankrupt you, take your house, and legally destroy your character in family court. The choice is yours." The room fell completely silent. Jamal was leaning back in his expensive leather chair, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He actually thought he had won. He thought I was just a terrified single mother who would crumble under the combined weight of expensive legal threats and toxic family pressure. He completely forgot that I dismantle arrogant corporate criminals for a living. My own lawyer sat perfectly still beside me, waiting for my signal because he already knew exactly what was inside my black folder. I looked down at the shiny gold-plated pen. I looked at the signature line that would sign away my beautiful 7-year-old daughter and hand over her $3 million inheritance to a pair of ruthless predators. I slowly reached my hand forward. Penelope let out a quiet sigh of relief, and Jamal sat up slightly eagerly anticipating his massive payday. But my hand did not pick up the heavy gold pen. Instead, I placed my index finger firmly against the cold side of it and pushed it straight back across the polished mahogany table. It slid all the way over and hit Vance right in the knuckles. I looked directly into Jamal's dark eyes, my expression absolutely, completely unreadable and cold. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive room. "But since we are all gathered here to discuss financial stability, I am going to explain exactly where Jamal's money went." Vance let out a loud, harsh bark of laughter. He leaned forward, attempting to grab the thick black folder from my hands. "We are not here to listen to your baseless conspiracy theories, Madison," he sneered loudly. "You are entirely out of your depth. This is a waste of my valuable billable hours." But my attorney calmly reached out and clamped his hand firmly down on the file, blocking Vance completely. "My client has the floor," my lawyer stated with a voice like crushed ice. "I strongly suggest you sit back and listen, because what she is about to show you will completely alter the trajectory of your client's life." I slowly untied the black string of the folder and flipped open the heavy cover. The first document was a certified copy of the quarterly corporate tax filings for Jamal's investment firm. I slid it across the smooth mahogany surface right over the ridiculous settlement contract. Jamal shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair, but he maintained his arrogant smirk. "You see, Jamal loves to project the image of a highly successful chief financial officer." I began, keeping my tone completely analytical and devoid of any emotion. "He wears custom Tom Ford suits. He drives a leased luxury car. He talks a big game about market yields and venture capital at every single family gathering. But it is all an incredibly fragile illusion." I tapped my index finger on the financial statement. "According to the state business registry and your own internal corporate ledgers, your supposedly elite investment firm has been completely insolvent for exactly 8 months. The smug smirk on Jamal's face instantly vanished. He sat up bone straight, his dark eyes widening in genuine shock. "How did you get those documents?" he demanded, his voice losing its smooth, confident edge. "Those are strictly confidential internal records." I ignored his panic and pulled out the next stack of papers. I had spent all night verifying every single transaction. As a forensic accountant, I know exactly how to trace ghost accounts and phantom shell companies. I continued smoothly. "You have been aggressively bleeding your own firm dry, creating fake vendor invoices and routing client funds to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands just to keep the lights on. But even that was not enough to sustain your lavish lifestyle, was it?" I turned my attention to Penelope, who was glaring at me with her arms tightly crossed over her pristine white Chanel blazer. "Penelope, you have spent the last 5 years mocking my financial choices," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper. "You love to show off your expensive designer bags and brag about your exclusive country club memberships. But I pulled the credit reports." I slid a heavily highlighted bank statement toward her. "Every single item you are wearing today was purchased on high-interest credit cards that are currently maxed out to their absolute limits. You two are drowning in over $400,000 of unsecured consumer debt." Penelope let out a sharp gasp. She stared blindly at the highlighted numbers on the page. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble. She looked up at her husband, her face draining of all color. "Jamal, tell me she is lying," Penelope whispered, her voice cracking with sudden, terrifying realization. "Tell me we are not broke." Jamal refused to look at her, His jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle twitched violently in his cheek. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Vance tried to intervene immediately, scrambling to gather the exposed documents. "This is a blatant violation of privacy," Vance argued loudly. "None of this financial hearsay has anything to do with the civil lawsuit at hand." "It has absolutely everything to do with the lawsuit," I countered sharply. "Because Jamal did not file this ridiculous $1 million claim out of emotional distress. He did not file it because he felt victimized by a simple plastic cup. He filed it out of absolute sheer desperation." I pulled out the next document, which carried the unmistakable official seal of the federal government. I placed it directly in the center of the table, where my parents could clearly see it from the back row. "Their luxury mortgage on that beautiful 5-bedroom estate is currently 90 days past due," I announced, watching my parents' faces crumple in horror. "The bank initiated preliminary foreclosure proceedings last Tuesday. They are entirely destitute." Penelope turned completely pale, suddenly looking at Jamal in sheer, absolute panic. But the financial ruin was only the beginning. I dropped the next catastrophic bomb right onto the mahogany table. "Jamal owes the Internal Revenue Service $2 million in unpaid back taxes, and he is actively under federal investigation for criminal wire fraud." The heavy oak room fell into a suffocating absolute silence following my declaration. The words "federal investigation" and "wire fraud" hung in the chilled air of the corporate conference room like a live grenade. Jamal slammed both of his large hands flat onto the mahogany table. The sudden, violent sound made my mother jump in her seat. He shot out of his expensive leather chair, his face contorted in a mask of pure feral panic. "You hacked my private servers!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "This mediation is completely over, Vance. She committed a federal cybercrime to get those files. Call the police right now and have her arrested for corporate espionage." Vance practically leaped out of his seat, frantically shoving the 20-page settlement contract back into his leather briefcase. He looked at Jamal with genuine alarm, clearly unaware of the massive criminal liability sitting right next to him. "My client is absolutely correct, Madison," Vance stated, his voice tight with sudden anxiety. "If you illegally breached the firewalls of an investment firm to obtain these confidential tax documents, you are facing severe prison time. This is inadmissible blackmail, and we are leaving this room immediately." I did not move a single muscle. I leaned back comfortably in my chair and let out a soft, chilling smirk. "I did not hack anything, Jamal," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even and dripping with condescension. "You are just incredibly sloppy. You built a maze of offshore shell companies, assuming nobody would ever bother to follow the digital paper trail. But you used your own middle name and your childhood zip code to register the holding corporation in the Cayman Islands. It took me less than 3 hours to crack your ridiculous naming convention. Once I had the exact corporate entity, names every single document I just placed on this table was completely accessible through international public business registries. I paid a $75 administrative fee to download your entire financial ruin legally." Jamal stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He realized in that exact moment that his sophisticated corporate shield was completely useless against a trained forensic accountant. I turned my attention back to my parents, who were sitting in the back row, completely paralyzed by the unfolding catastrophe. "This was never about a plastic cup," I announced, my voice rising to fill the massive room. "This was never about Jamal suffering a tragic allergic reaction or Penelope being a concerned aunt. This was a calculated, predatory heist." I looked directly at my sister. Her pristine white Chanel blazer suddenly looked like a cheap costume. "You ran out of credit, Penelope," I explained methodically. "The bank is taking your massive house. The federal government is preparing to indict your husband for stealing millions of dollars. You were completely cornered and absolutely desperate for liquid cash." Then you remembered that my 7-year-old daughter possesses a $3 million trust fund. Penelope shook her head wildly, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. That is not true, Madison. We just wanted to protect Sophie from your reckless behavior. I slammed my hand down on the mahogany table, silencing her instantly. You wanted to drug my daughter? I fired back, the anger finally bleeding into my voice. You brought potent narcotics to my housewarming party. Your plan was to poison Sophie just enough to trigger an emergency room visit. You knew the hospital would automatically call Child Protective Services if a minor ingested drugs at my house. You wanted to frame me as a negligent mother so the family court would strip me of my parental rights. And once I was out of the picture, you and Jamal would graciously step in to adopt her. You would become the legal guardians and gain absolute unhindered access to her $3 million trust fund. You were going to use my grandfather's money to pay off the Internal Revenue Service and keep your pathetic husband out of federal prison. My father let out a choked gasp, covering his mouth with his trembling hand. My mother stared at Penelope, her eyes wide with horrific realization. The pristine image of their golden child was rapidly dissolving into a portrait of a ruthless monster. Vance, the high-powered attorney, slowly zipped his briefcase shut and took a massive step away from Jamal. He recognized a sinking ship when he saw one. Jamal slowly sank back down into his leather chair. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a completely defeated man. He looked at the massive stack of financial evidence, knowing his entire life was over. He thought the worst of his secrets were finally out on the mahogany table. He thought the absolute bottom had been reached. I picked up the final file from my black folder. It was a thin manila envelope sealed with red tape. I held it up, letting the harsh overhead lights catch the edges. But the Internal Revenue Service is not the only thing draining your bank accounts, Jamal. I slowly broke the red tape on the manila envelope. Jamal was staring at the envelope as if it were a loaded weapon aimed directly at his chest. His eyes darted toward the heavy wooden door, his survival instincts clearly telling him to run. But he was completely frozen in his chair, trapped by the overwhelming weight of his own collapsing empire. I reached inside the manila folder and pulled out a thick stack of glossy credit card statements. These are from a highly exclusive invite-only Platinum credit card. I began sliding the top statement directly toward Penelope. A card completely hidden from your joint financial disclosures and separate from your maxed-out consumer accounts. I watched my sister pick up the paper with trembling hands. She scanned the top lines, her brow furrowing in deep confusion as she looked at the unfamiliar account numbers. Look at the recurring monthly charges on page 2, I instructed her, calmly pointing at the highlighted section. Every single month on the first day, there is an automatic withdrawal for $6,500. That is a luxury lease payment for a penthouse apartment in the Gold Coast neighborhood, a property neither of you owns, and an address you have never lived at in your entire life. Penelope looked up at Jamal, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and denial. What is this apartment, Jamal? She asked, her eyes pleading for a reasonable explanation. Are you hiding assets there? Are you trying to hide money from the federal government so they do not take everything we have? He is hiding a lot more than just money, Penelope. I interjected before he could formulate another slick corporate lie. Keep reading down the itemized list. 3 weeks before your lavish 5th anniversary last year, there is a massive charge for $32,000 at a boutique diamond jeweler. Do you remember getting a $32,000 diamond necklace for your anniversary, Penelope? She shook her head slowly, her face completely pale and drained of all emotion. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. He bought me a designer silk scarf. I never got a diamond necklace. I turned to the next page in my investigative file. Because the expensive diamond necklace was never meant for you, I stated coldly. It was purchased for a woman named Lauren, the exact same woman whose name is officially listed on the lease agreement for that luxury Gold Coast penthouse. My mother let out a loud, dramatic gasp from the back of the room, her hand flying to her chest in absolute horror. My father stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "Are you telling us he is having a sleazy affair?" my father demanded, stepping toward the mahogany table. "It is far beyond a simple sleazy affair," I corrected him, pulling out the most devastating documents in the entire folder. I placed a series of medical billing statements onto the smooth wood, arranging them so everyone could clearly read the hospital letterheads. Over the past 3 years, this hidden platinum card has paid for premium prenatal care at a private boutique clinic. It paid for a luxury birthing suite at Memorial Hospital exactly 2 years and 4 months ago. And it continues to pay for elite pediatric care every single month, without fail. The air in the room completely vanished. Penelope stopped breathing. She stared blindly at the medical bills, her mind violently struggling to process the catastrophic reality unfolding in front of her. Jamal did not just have a temporary mistress on the side. He had a completely separate life. "You have a 2-year-old son, Jamal," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a razor blade. "A secret child you have been entirely funding with the embezzled corporate money from your failing investment firm. While you and Penelope were parading around the affluent country club playing the perfect golden couple, you were funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars to your second family. You stole from your own corporate clients, you defrauded the Internal Revenue Service, and you tried to poison my 7-year-old daughter, all to maintain this disgusting double life." The pristine, flawless image of their perfect marriage shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before our eyes. The golden child and her perfect husband were nothing but a massive, ugly lie built on toxic deception. Jamal finally found his voice. He raised his hands in a pathetic defensive gesture, looking pleadingly at his wife. "Penelope, baby, please listen to me," he begged, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "I can explain everything to you. It was a stupid mistake. She means absolutely nothing to me." But Penelope was no longer listening to his silver-tongued corporate apologies. The profound shock on her face rapidly morphed into pure, unhinged, violent rage. She looked at the man she had just committed multiple felonies to protect. She had actively risked federal prison, ruined her relationship with her only sister, and nearly murdered her own niece, all to save a man who was using the stolen money to buy diamonds for his secret baby mother. Penelope let out a completely feral, blood-curdling scream that echoed off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Before anyone could even react, she planted her hands firmly on the edge of the heavy mahogany table and violently lunged across it at her husband. Penelope crashed into Jamal with the devastating force of a completely broken woman. Her pristine white Chanel blazer smeared harshly across the polished mahogany wood as she scrambled forward, grabbing handfuls of his custom navy suit. She was no longer the poised, affluent country club socialite she had pretended to be. She was a feral wild animal tearing fiercely at the deceitful man who had systematically destroyed her entire reality. "You lying, disgusting piece of garbage!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a sickening guttural sob that reverberated against the glass windows. "You bought her expensive diamonds with our stolen money. You had a secret baby with her, while I was defending you against my own family and the police." She slapped his face wildly, her manicured nails catching his right cheek and leaving a bright, angry red scratch straight down the side of his jaw. The heavy designer leather chair abruptly tipped backward under their sudden combined weight, sending both of them crashing violently to the hardwood floor in a chaotic tangle of expensive torn fabric and furious thrashing limbs. My parents erupted into a state of absolute blind panic. My mother shrieked, covering her eyes with both trembling hands, as if she were shielding herself from witnessing a horrific car crash. My father rushed around the massive conference table, shouting for them to stop this insane behavior, but he was way too terrified of Jamal's physical size and unhinged anger to actually step in and physically separate them. Vance, the high-powered attorney, did not even try to stay and help his affluent client. He rapidly grabbed his leather briefcase and sprinted toward the heavy oak doors, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the massive criminal fraud and civil liability violently exploding inside his prestigious conference room. The pristine, organized stacks of catastrophic financial evidence I had so carefully printed and arranged were violently swept completely off the large table, fluttering wildly through the chilled air like morbid corporate confetti. Bank statements detailing hidden offshore accounts and premium medical bills for a secret 2-year-old child rained down heavily on the battling toxic couple. My own attorney simply took a slow, calculated step back, crossing his arms and watching the absolute destruction of their lives with cold, clinical detachment. Jamal let out a loud, furious roar. He was substantially larger and much stronger than Penelope. He aggressively grabbed both of her wrists in his massive hands, squeezing them brutally until she cried out in sudden, sharp pain. With a violent shove, he pushed her entirely off his chest, sending her sliding across the polished hardwood floor. Penelope hit the solid base of the heavy conference table and collapsed into a pathetic, sobbing, devastated heap on the ground. Jamal scrambled to his feet, his broad chest heaving as he gasped for oxygen in the tense room. His custom Tom Ford suit was completely ruined, torn violently at the left shoulder, and covered entirely in gray floor dust. He reached his large hand up and wiped a streak of fresh blood from his deeply scratched cheek, staring blankly at the bright red smear on his thick fingers. For a brief, fleeting second, he looked exactly like a cornered, terrified wild animal caught in a trap. But then I watched in absolute disgust as his sociopathic corporate survival instincts rapidly rebooted. He took a very deep, jagged breath and aggressively straightened his ruined silk tie, pulling his jacket down. The frantic panic completely vanished from his dark eyes, rapidly replaced by an incredibly chilling, hollow calm. He slowly turned his head away from his weeping, broken wife, ignoring her agonizing sobs, and locked his dead gaze directly onto me. He intentionally stepped right over the scattered offshore bank statements and the secret hospital bills, crushing the undeniable printed proof of his profound infidelity beneath his expensive leather shoes. He walked slowly back toward my side of the long table, leaning his two large hands heavily on the polished mahogany wood. He looked down at the empty black folder sitting in front of me, and then he looked right into my eyes. The sheer audacity of the man in that exact moment was entirely terrifying. He let out a low, dark, cruel laugh that echoed horribly over the pathetic sound of Penelope's broken sobbing. He tilted his head slightly, his facial expression hardening into pure, unadulterated hatred. He genuinely believed he could still win this insane war. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Madison?" he sneered, his voice dripping with toxic, arrogant venom. "You cannot prove any of this in court today. Those papers mean absolutely nothing without a federal subpoena. And you still poisoned me. The police are on my side and my lawsuit will take your house anyway." Jamal's words hung in the suffocating air of the destroyed conference room. He was still desperately clinging to the delusion that his fabricated $1 million civil lawsuit was his ultimate trump card. He thought the local police department investigating a domestic poisoning dispute would somehow shield him from the massive federal crimes I had just exposed. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or scramble to defend my brand new $1.2 million home. Instead, I slowly lifted my left wrist and casually checked my watch. It was exactly 10:30 in the morning, right on schedule. I looked up from my watch and met his hateful dark eyes with a look of absolute pity. "You are fundamentally misunderstanding the severity of your current situation," I said softly. "You are still trying to play a game of checkers while the board has already been flipped over. I am not the one taking your house, Jamal, and I am certainly not the one you need to be worried about right now." Before Jamal could even process the chilling weight of my statement, the heavy oak doors of the luxury conference room swung open with a resounding thud. My attorney, who had been standing silently near the glass wall, immediately stepped aside to clear the entryway. Two tall, broad-shouldered men walked into the ruined room. They were not local police officers responding to a domestic disturbance. They were not corporate lawyers looking to negotiate a financial settlement. They were wearing dark, tactical windbreakers with 3 bold yellow letters printed clearly across the front. DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. The entire room completely froze. My mother let out a strangled gasp, pulling her designer purse tightly against her chest. My father stumbled backward, bumping into the credenza, his face draining of all remaining color. Penelope, who was still sobbing on the hardwood floor, abruptly stopped crying. She stared up at the federal agents with wide, terrified eyes, her breath catching sharply in her throat. The sheer presence of federal law enforcement completely vacuumed whatever remaining oxygen existed in the room. The lead agent, a stern-looking man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, scanned the absolute wreckage of the room. He took in the overturned leather chair, the torn custom Tom Ford suit on Jamal's back, and the catastrophic financial documents scattered everywhere like trash. He did not look surprised. He looked entirely prepared. My lawyer nodded professionally to the lead agent. "The financial dossiers you requested are right here on the floor," my lawyer stated calmly. She has successfully traced the offshore accounts and the phantom shell companies directly linked to the illicit funds. Jamal whipped his head around to look at me, his dark eyes wide with sudden horrific realization. The arrogance completely melted off his face, leaving nothing but raw, primal terror. "You called the feds," he whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "You brought federal drug agents into a civil mediation." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. "I did not call them today, Jamal," I corrected him coldly. "I called them 3 days ago while you were still lying in your hospital bed spinning your pathetic lies to the local police. You thought you were so incredibly clever, claiming the crushed powder was just your prescription allergy medication," I continued. "You used that lie to completely shut down the attempted murder investigation against my sister, but you severely underestimated my professional connections. As a forensic accountant, I frequently consult for federal agencies tracing laundered money for massive criminal syndicates. When I saw the chalky residue in that pink mocktail, I knew it was not a standard over-the-counter allergy pill. I secretly scraped a tiny physical sample from the plastic cup before the paramedics even arrived. I overnighted that evidence to a private forensic laboratory I use for corporate investigations. The specialized lab confirmed my absolute worst suspicions within 24 hours. You were laundering money for an illegal prescription drug ring. You used their illicit products to poison your own family. The lead agent stepped fully into the conference room. His partner, a highly imposing man with a thick beard, moved quickly behind him and firmly pushed the heavy oak doors shut. The loud, definitive click of the metal deadbolt echoing through the silent room sounded exactly like a prison cell slamming closed. The partner crossed his arms, blocking the only exit. The lead agent reached beneath his dark windbreaker and pulled out a thick stack of federal warrants. He looked directly at the crumbling chief financial officer. "Jamal," he said, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority, "keep your hands where I can see them and step away from the table right now." Jamal slowly raised his trembling hands into the air, taking 2 clumsy steps backward away from the heavy mahogany table. His expensive leather shoes scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The second federal agent immediately moved behind him expertly, patting down his ruined custom Navy suit for any concealed weapons. Penelope remained completely frozen on the floor as she stared blankly at the men in dark windbreakers. Her tear-streaked face, a mask of absolute bewilderment. She looked from the heavily armed federal agents to her terrified husband, completely unable to process how a fabricated local police report had instantly escalated into a major federal drug raid. My parents were equally paralyzed, huddled together near the back wall like frightened children. "You are probably wondering how a simple allergy pill summons the Drug Enforcement Administration," Penelope Fry said, looking down at my sister. "Allow me to clarify the medical reality of what actually happened the night of my housewarming party. While you and Mom and Dad were busy putting on a hysterical theatrical performance in the emergency room waiting area, lying to the local police about my supposed jealousy, I was having a very quiet, very serious conversation with the attending physician. I did not just sit in that stiff plastic chair and wait to be arrested by the authorities. As soon as the doctor stabilized Jamal's crashing heart rate, I formally demanded a comprehensive toxicology report. My mother gasped in shock, her hand flying to her mouth again. "You had no right to order medical tests on my son-in-law," she protested weakly, her voice trembling with misplaced indignation. "I had every right." I snapped back, my patience completely exhausted. "I was the primary suspect in an active attempted murder investigation tonight. I needed absolute scientific proof to clear my name quickly." The emergency room doctor agreed that given the severe neurological symptoms Jamal was exhibiting, a standard allergy screening was completely insufficient. They drew his blood and rushed the vials to the hospital laboratory for a full-spectrum chemical analysis. I looked directly at Jamal, who was now sweating profusely under the harsh overhead chandelier lighting. The federal agent standing behind him clamped a heavy hand onto his shoulder, keeping him securely in place. "The hospital laboratory results came back electronically while you were still fast asleep in the intensive care unit," I continued, my voice echoing in the silent room. "And the chemical compound swimming through your bloodstream was absolutely not an over-the-counter antihistamine. It was not a prescription allergy medication either. The toxicology report positively identified a massive lethal dose of a highly restricted Schedule II illicit narcotic. It was a potent synthetic compound, specifically engineered to mimic medical-grade sedatives, but manufactured in illegal underground laboratories." Penelope stared at Jamal, her jaw physically dropping. "You brought Schedule II narcotics to a party with a 7-year-old child," she whispered, her voice cracking with raw disbelief. She had been willing to drug my daughter to steal her trust fund, but she clearly believed she was using something relatively harmless like a crushed sleeping pill. Jamal had handed her a highly lethal synthetic narcotic without telling her what it actually was. He had actively turned his own wife into a potential murderer just to orchestrate a fake medical emergency. But the toxicology report was only the first piece of the puzzle, I explained, keeping my eyes locked on Jamal's sweating face. I needed to know exactly how a supposedly legitimate chief financial officer obtained raw, uncut synthetic narcotics. That is when I cross-referenced the chemical signature of the drug with your fraudulent corporate ledgers. The money you were bleeding from your investment firm was not just going to your secret mistress in the Gold Coast penthouse. And it was not just being hidden from the Internal Revenue Service in the Cayman Islands. You were actively washing millions of dollars in dirty street cash. The lead federal agent nodded, stepping forward and placing a thick evidence bag onto the mahogany table right next to the scattered financial documents. Inside the plastic bag was a stack of heavily encrypted hard drives they had already seized from Jamal's downtown office earlier that morning. "You are a highly sophisticated money launderer, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, unforgiving register. "You used your prestigious corporate investment firm to clean millions of dollars for a massive illegal prescription drug ring operating across the Midwest. You took their dirty cash, funneled it through your phantom shell companies, and returned it to them as clean corporate dividends. The drug that nearly stopped your heart on my backyard patio was the exact same illicit narcotic your violent criminal associates are currently flooding directly into our local city streets." Jamal stared directly at me, his massive chest heaving heavily as the crushing reality of my words finally penetrated his thick skull. He looked exactly like a terrified man who had just stepped off a steep cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. But his massive ego still refused to accept total defeat. He turned his attention back to the lead federal agent, desperately grasping at any legal technicality he could find. "This is a blatant violation of my civil rights," Jamal yelled, his voice echoing sharply in the confined space. "You cannot use my private medical records to build a federal criminal case against me. That is a direct violation of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. My hospital records are strictly confidential. Any judge in this city will throw this entire investigation out of court before you even file the paperwork." The lead agent did not even blink at Jamal's aggressive outburst. He simply offered a cold, humorless smile. "You really should have hired a competent criminal defense attorney instead of a civil litigator," the agent replied smoothly. "Because you clearly do not understand how federal mandatory reporting laws actually function." The agent took a slow step closer to the mahogany table, his authoritative presence dominating the room. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act protects patients from having their personal medical history shared without consent. The agent explained, his voice projecting clearly. But there are very specific ironclad exceptions to that rule. When an emergency room physician discovers a lethal dose of a highly restricted synthetic schedule, too narcotic in a patient's bloodstream, and the circumstances strongly indicate a deliberate poisoning or foul play, standard medical privacy rules are immediately suspended. It becomes an active public safety hazard. The hospital protocol mandates that they automatically flag the toxicology results and forward them directly to federal law enforcement authorities. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "I did not violate your precious medical privacy, Jamal," I stated calmly. "The federal government already had your toxicology report sitting on their desks before the sun even came up the next morning. They already knew you ingested the exact synthetic compound they had been desperately trying to trace for the past 16 months. But they did not know how a wealthy, supposedly respectable corporate executive ended up swallowing a cartel-grade narcotic at a family barbecue." The second federal agent, the imposing man blocking the heavy oak doors, chimed in. "We had the drug and we had the patient," he said gruffly. "But we were missing the financial link. We knew the criminal syndicate was using a sophisticated corporate front to wash their illicit street cash, but their digital footprint was incredibly well hidden. That is exactly where I came in," I told Jamal, watching the last remaining ounce of hope drain completely from his face. "When the hospital ran that toxicology report, I knew exactly what you were hiding. I simply connected the dots between your tainted blood work and your offshore bank accounts. I packaged up your entire financial ruin, including the Cayman Islands shell companies, the fraudulent vendor invoices, and the exact routing numbers you used to transfer the dirty money. I handed the entire neatly organized dossier directly to the Drug Enforcement Administration. I gave them the exact financial roadmap they needed to completely dismantle your entire money laundering operation." Penelope let out a hollow, agonizing whimper. She was sitting on the hardwood floor, staring up at the man she had proudly married. He was not a wealthy corporate genius. He was a glorified criminal bagman for a violent drug syndicate, and he had dragged her directly into his catastrophic downfall. My parents remained entirely silent, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute horror. The golden couple they had worshipped and protected at my expense was completely obliterated. Jamal looked frantically around the room, his eyes darting toward the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, as if calculating the possibility of jumping through them to escape. But there was nowhere left to run. His bank accounts were seized. His luxury house was in foreclosure. His secret second family was exposed, and his criminal associates would undoubtedly turn against him the moment they realized he had led federal authorities right to their front door. He was completely and utterly trapped. The lead federal agent reached to the back of his tactical windbreaker. The sharp metallic sound of heavy steel handcuffs being unclipped from a utility belt echoed loudly in the silent conference room. "Jamal, you are under arrest for federal drug distribution, wire fraud, and international money laundering." The agent announced, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "You are looking at a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary." The words 20 years hit Jamal with the brutal physical force of a freight train. His knees actually buckled beneath him, and the second federal agent had to aggressively yank him backward by the collar of his ruined customs suit just to keep him standing upright. The hollow, arrogant shell of the slick chief financial officer completely evaporated, leaving nothing behind but a desperate, cornered rat. He knew exactly what 20 years in a federal penitentiary meant for a wealthy corporate executive who had just burned a highly violent drug syndicate. He would not survive his first week behind bars. His eyes darted wildly around the room, frantically searching for any possible lifeline, any sacrificial lamb he could offer the federal government to save his own skin. And he found one sitting right there on the polished hardwood floor beneath him. "Wait, listen to me!" Jamal screamed, his voice cracking with absolute panic as he struggled against the heavy steel handcuffs binding his wrists behind his back. "I can give you the syndicate bosses. I can give you the offshore account numbers, the encrypted passwords, everything. But you have to listen to me about the poisoning. That was not my operation. I did not want to hurt the kid. It was all her idea." He aggressively thrust his chin down toward Penelope, who was still slumped against the base of the heavy mahogany table. Penelope jerked her head up, her tear-streaked face twisting in profound confusion. "Jamal, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at the man she had just violently fought to protect. "I am telling them the absolute truth." Jamal roared back, his self-preservation instincts completely overriding whatever twisted affection he ever held for his wife. He turned his frantic gaze back to the lead federal agent. "I just laundered the dirty money. I never handled the actual product. It was Penelope who took the drugs. She found my encrypted burner phone and she saw the text messages from my associates. When she realized we were completely broke and facing foreclosure, she is the one who came up with the sick plan to steal her niece's trust fund." My mother let out an agonizing wail from the back of the room, clutching my father's arm as if she were about to faint. "You are lying," my mother shrieked at him. "My daughter would never do something so monstrous. She did it!" Jamal yelled over my mother's hysterical crying, his words spilling out in a rapid, desperate torrent of betrayal. "She demanded that I get her a sedative from my contacts. She said Madison was always paranoid, so if we drugged the kid at the housewarming party, we could immediately call an ambulance and trigger a mandatory Child Protective Services investigation. She wanted to frame Madison as an unfit mother, so the family court would hand us emergency custody of the kid and the $3 million bank account. She crushed the pill. She put it in the cup. I had absolutely nothing to do with the actual poisoning. You saw the security footage yourselves. She is the one on tape." I watched the horrific scene unfold with absolute chilling clarity. Jamal was actively trying to negotiate a federal plea deal right there in the middle of the luxury conference room. He was fully prepared to hand the federal authorities the entire drug syndicate and his own wife on a silver platter just to shave a few years off his mandatory prison sentence. He was systematically unloading every single ounce of criminal liability directly onto Penelope. The lead federal agent pulled a small digital voice recorder from his tactical windbreaker and held it up, the red recording light blinking ominously in the tense air. "So you are formally stating on the official record that your wife willfully conspired to obtain Schedule II narcotics with the explicit intent to poison a 7-year-old child for financial gain?" the agent asked, his tone perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. "Yes," Jamal shouted instantly without a single microsecond of hesitation. "She planned the entire thing. Arrest her. Charge her with the attempted murder. I will testify against her in federal court if you give me a deal." Penelope sat completely paralyzed on the cold hardwood floor. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over her in a suffocating wave. She had lied to the local police for him. She had actively tried to destroy my life to protect his dirty secrets. And in return, the moment he was backed into a corner, he ruthlessly threw her straight to the wolves. She looked up at the federal agents, her chest heaving as the mathematical reality of his confession finally clicked in her mind. She finally realized her husband just handed her a minimum 10-year federal prison sentence to get a plea deal for himself. The realization hit Penelope like a physical blow. The man she had lied for, the man she had nearly murdered her own niece for, had just traded her life for a reduced prison sentence. She pushed herself up from the hardwood floor. Her pristine blazer was ruined, her perfect hair a mess, but her eyes burned with a terrifying, unhinged fury. If Jamal thought he could walk away clean by throwing her under the bus, he was completely mistaken. She looked directly at the lead federal agent holding the blinking digital voice recorder. "You want the truth?" Penelope screamed, her voice echoing violently. I will give you the absolute truth. He is lying about the poisoning being my idea. He brought the pills home. He told me it was the only way to get my grandfather's money to save us from foreclosure. But that is not even the worst thing he has done. Penelope stepped closer to Jamal, ignoring the federal agent behind him. You want to talk about the money laundering, Jamal? She shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at his face. Let us talk about the forged board signatures. Let us talk about how you forced me to sign as the primary shareholder on those Cayman Islands shell companies, so that if you ever got caught, I would take the fall. You told me it was just a tax loophole. And what about the bribes? Tell them about the massive cash bribes you paid the city zoning commissioner last year to get those commercial permits approved for your cartel bosses. Jamal lunged forward, fighting against the heavy steel handcuffs binding his wrists. Shut your mouth, Penelope, he roared, his face turning purple. You are digging your own grave. But the lead federal agent simply held up his hand, signaling his partner to hold Jamal back while keeping the digital recorder pointed directly at Penelope. Let her speak, the agent commanded coldly. She is providing excellent voluntary testimony. Jamal thrashed against the agent's grip. She knew exactly where the money was coming from. Jamal yelled, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. She is not some innocent victim. When I told her the investment firm was going under, she actively helped me set up the fake vendor invoices. She used her laptop to wire the dirty cash into our accounts. She loved the money. She loved the designer clothes and the luxury cars. She did not care that it was blood money until the exact second you walked into this room. Penelope let out a vicious, mocking laugh. I only helped because you threatened to leave me penniless, she fired back. You are a disgusting sociopath, Jamal. You spent the cartel money on a secret apartment for your mistress and a baby I did not even know existed. You stole from my family. You stole from your clients. You are nothing but a pathetic fraud, Jamal spat right back at her. And you are a greedy, shallow monster who was willing to drug a 7-year-old child just to maintain your country club membership. You are exactly the same as me, Penelope. We are both going to burn. The verbal massacre continued for another 5 agonizing minutes. They viciously screamed out every illegal, toxic thing they had done together over the last 5 years. They confessed to wire fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy, and extortion, fully incriminating each other on a federal audio tape in front of the Drug Enforcement Administration, my lawyer, and our completely shattered parents. My mother wept uncontrollably into my father's shoulder, finally forced to witness the horrifying truth of her golden child. My father simply stared at the floor, looking as though he had aged 20 years in a single hour. They had enabled Penelope's toxic behavior her entire life, and now they were watching that exact toxicity completely destroy her. The lead agent finally clicked his digital voice recorder, turning off the red light. I think we have heard more than enough to secure federal indictments for both of you, the agent stated firmly. He nodded to his imposing partner. The partner aggressively shoved Jamal toward the heavy oak doors. The lead agent pulled a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical windbreaker and walked directly toward my sister. Penelope did not even try to fight or run away. She just held out her trembling wrists, completely defeated by her own monumental greed. The loud metallic click of the handcuffs echoed sharply in the silent room. Penelope, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, federal wire fraud, and money laundering, the agent announced loudly. Both Jamal and Penelope were firmly grabbed by the arms, dragged out of the plush conference room, and marched straight toward the waiting federal transport vehicles. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the federal agents, leaving behind a sudden suffocating silence in the massive conference room. The chaotic screaming and the harsh metallic clinking of the steel handcuffs faded down the corporate hallway. Only the sound of my mother's ragged, hysterical sobbing remained. She was clutching the edge of the polished mahogany table, her knuckles completely white, as she stared blankly at the empty space where her golden child had just been standing. My father looked entirely paralyzed. His shoulders sagged heavily, and his face had aged decades in a matter of minutes. The pristine illusion of their perfect affluent family had just been violently incinerated right in front of their eyes. My lawyer quietly began gathering his legal pads and pens, sliding them neatly into his leather briefcase. He did not say a single word. He had witnessed countless corporate downfalls, but the raw, toxic destruction of a family unit was entirely different. I did not move immediately. I stood perfectly still, taking a long, deep breath of the chilled, air-conditioned air. The crushing weight of the past week, the false police reports, the $1 million civil lawsuit, the terrifying threats to steal my 7-year-old daughter finally began to lift from my chest. I had successfully protected Sophie. I had successfully protected my hard-earned home. I had completely dismantled the predators who tried to consume us. But my mother was not finished demanding my sacrifice. She slowly turned her tear-streaked face toward me. Her eyes were completely bloodshot and wild with a desperate, frantic energy. She let go of the mahogany table and stumbled forward, her expensive silk dress tangling around her legs. Before my father could even reach out to steady her, she collapsed heavily onto her knees right on the hardwood floor directly in front of me. She reached out with trembling hands, aggressively grabbing the fabric of my skirt. "Madison, please," she wailed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, agonizing shriek. "You have to stop this. You have to call those federal agents and tell them it was all a terrible misunderstanding. You know powerful people, Madison. You work with federal authorities all the time. Use your professional connections. Use your money. Hire the best criminal defense attorneys in the city and bail her out today. She is your sister, you have to save her." I stared down at the woman who had birthed me. Even now, after witnessing Penelope verbally confess to money laundering and conspiring to drug a 7-year-old child, my mother was still fiercely protecting the golden child. She was still actively demanding that I light my own life on fire to keep Penelope warm. She expected me to spend the very wealth Penelope had just tried to steal to rescue her from a federal penitentiary. The absolute delusion was staggering. I gently but firmly reached down and pried her trembling fingers off my clothing. I took a deliberate step backward, putting physical distance between us. I reached over to the table, picked up my empty black folder and slid it into my leather tote bag. I zipped the bag shut with a loud, definitive pull. "You want me to save her?" I asked, my voice dropping to a freezing, clinical whisper. "You want me to use my hard-earned money to bail out a woman who explicitly planned to poison your only granddaughter?" My mother covered her face with her hands, sobbing loudly. "She made a mistake," my mother cried out blindly, making excuses for the unforgivable. "She was just desperate and scared of Jamal. She did not mean to actually hurt Sophie." I looked over at my father, who was staring at the floor, completely unable to meet my gaze. "Your golden child did not make a simple mistake," I corrected her coldly. "She made a calculated, predatory choice. She chose to buy a highly lethal synthetic narcotic. She chose to crush it up. She chose to put it into a pink plastic cup and hand it directly to an innocent little girl. And when her plan failed, she chose to file a false police report to frame me for attempted murder." "And what did you two do?" I pointed a steady finger directly at my father. "You stood in that emergency room and eagerly backed up every single one of her malicious lies. You threatened to perjure yourselves in family court to help her steal Sophie's trust fund. You were fully prepared to let me rot in a prison cell and let my daughter be raised by a pair of sociopathic criminals just so you could maintain your pathetic country club image. I am not saving her. You built this toxic wreckage. Now live in it alone." My father finally found his voice. He took a hesitant step forward, raising his hands in a weak, placating gesture. "Madison, please try to understand." He stammered, his voice lacking any of the authoritarian weight it usually carried. "We were just trying to protect our family. We did not know the full extent of what Jamal was involved in. We thought it was just a terrible mistake and we panicked. We did not want to see Penelope lose everything she had worked so hard for." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that cut right through his pathetic excuses. "Worked hard for," I repeated, my tone dripping with absolute disdain. Penelope has never worked a single hard day in her entire pampered life. And you did not panic, Dad. Panicking is an emotional reaction. What you two did in that emergency room was a calculated, cold-blooded assassination of my character. You sat there and actively conspired to destroy my life, because I have always been nothing more than an expendable scapegoat to you both. I stepped closer to them, refusing to let them look away from the ugly reality of their own parenting. For 33 years, I have swallowed your relentless favoritism. I said, my voice steady but vibrating with decades of suppressed anger. When Penelope wanted to go to an elite private college, you entirely drained your savings to pay her tuition in full. When I got accepted into a top-tier accounting program, you told me I would have to take out student loans because you could not afford to support 2 children. When she got married, you threw a lavish $80,000 country club wedding. When I bought my first apartment, you did not even bother to show up for the housewarming dinner because Penelope had a minor cold and needed her mother. My mother flinched, as if I had physically struck her, fresh tears spilling down her ruined makeup. "We loved you both equally," she sobbed defensively. "You were just always so independent, Madison. You did not need us the way she did. I did need you." I fired back, my voice echoing in the empty corporate room. "I was your child. But you conditioned me to be independent, because relying on you always resulted in profound disappointment. You worshipped Penelope because she played the role of the perfect dependent golden child who made you look successful to your affluent friends. You fed her massive ego, covered up all her mistakes, and constantly validated her toxic behavior. And when grandfather recognized her extreme entitlement and rightfully left his money in a trust fund for Sophie, you treated me like a criminal who had stolen your inheritance. I looked at the two of them, feeling absolutely nothing but a deep, hollow pity. But all of that childhood neglect pales in comparison to what you did this week. I continued my words, hitting them like physical blows. Your obsessive need to protect Penelope morphed into pure evil. You literally watched the high-definition security footage of your oldest daughter crushing an unknown pill into a bright pink plastic cup meant for your 7-year-old granddaughter. You saw the visual proof of her attempting to drug a child. And instead of being horrified, instead of protecting Sophie, your immediate instinct was to help Penelope frame me for a felony. My father looked down at his expensive leather shoes, his shoulders shaking slightly. "We thought it was just a mild sleeping pill," he whispered pathetically. "We thought she just wanted to create a scare so we could get custody of Sophie and manage the trust fund. We never thought she would use something lethal." "That is exactly my point," I yelled, finally letting the raw fury bleed completely into my voice. "You were perfectly willing to let a 7-year-old child be drugged and traumatized, and you were perfectly willing to let me rot in a prison cell just to protect Penelope's fabricated image. You were willing to sacrifice my daughter on the altar of your golden child's massive ego. That is not love. That is a profound psychological sickness." I reached back into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I had prepared this document the moment I discovered the federal drug investigation. I forcefully slapped the heavy envelope directly against my father's chest. He reflexively grabbed it, looking down at the legal seal with wide, terrified eyes. "What is this?" my mother whimpered, stepping closer to him. "That is a permanent restraining order signed by a family court judge this morning," I stated with absolute finality. "I submitted the security footage, the false police reports you filed, and transcripts of your threatening voicemails." The judge immediately granted a full protective order. "If either of you comes within 500 feet of my house, my workplace, or Sophie's elementary school, you will be immediately arrested and thrown in a county jail cell." I picked up my bag and turned toward the heavy oak doors, not looking back at the two broken people standing in the wreckage of their own making. "You are legally barred from contacting me or Sophie ever again. Enjoy your empty family." I walked out of that luxury corporate law firm and stepped into the bright Chicago sunlight, breathing the freshest air I had tasted in my entire life. I did not look back. True to my word, I completely severed all ties with my biological family that very morning. The legal aftermath moved with the swift, ruthless efficiency of a federal sledgehammer. Jamal and Penelope thought they could outsmart the justice system the same way they had manipulated our family dynamics for decades. They were catastrophically wrong. Jamal immediately tried to formally leverage his offer to flip on the illicit prescription drug syndicate. He sat in a cold federal interrogation room, eagerly offering up names, distribution routes, and encrypted server locations. But he severely overestimated his own value. Thanks to the comprehensive financial dossier I had handed the Drug Enforcement Administration, the federal prosecutors already had every single piece of evidence they needed to dismantle the cartel. They did not need Jamal's cooperation, and they certainly were not going to offer full immunity to a man who actively attempted to poison a child. His desperate plea deal completely fell through. Furthermore, the mother of his secret child immediately abandoned him, taking their son, and disappearing the moment the asset freezes hit her luxury penthouse. The judge was absolutely merciless during sentencing. Jamal was handed a 10-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his custom suits, his arrogant corporate title, and his entire double life. Penelope faced an entirely different nightmare in federal court. She pleaded not guilty, attempting to play the role of the oblivious, victimized housewife who was brutally forced into signing corporate documents by her abusive husband. Her high-priced defense attorney tried to paint her as a tragic, manipulated figure. But the federal prosecutors brought a devastating piece of evidence into the courtroom to establish her true character. They played her viral social media video on a massive projector screen for the entire jury. They watched Penelope expertly cry on demand, manipulating the public and lying with chilling ease about the poisoning incident. The lead prosecutor pointed out that a woman capable of orchestrating such a flawless, premeditated public smear campaign against her own sister was more than capable of knowingly signing fraudulent offshore tax documents and deliberately dropping a crushed narcotic into a child's plastic cup. The jury did not deliberate for very long. Penelope sobbed hysterically as she was found guilty of felony child endangerment, criminal conspiracy, and federal wire fraud. Before she was even transferred to a federal women's prison to begin serving her sentence, the government seized absolutely everything she owned. The leased luxury vehicles, the designer handbags, the diamond jewelry, and the heavily mortgaged 5-bedroom estate were all liquidated by the federal government to pay off the Internal Revenue Service. Penelope was forced to file for absolute bankruptcy. Her perfectly curated country club life was replaced by a sterile cell, a concrete bed, and the terrifying reality that her manipulation tactics would absolutely not work on federal prison guards. My parents, unable to break their toxic cycle of enabling, threw absolutely everything they had into trying to save their golden child. Despite the undeniable public evidence of her monstrous actions, my mother stubbornly refused to accept reality. They hired a team of elite appellate lawyers to desperately fight Penelope's criminal conviction, burning through their liquid savings at a terrifying rate. When the cash ran out, they tapped into their retirement accounts, draining the funds they had spent their entire lives building. When those accounts were completely empty, the lawyers demanded more money to continue the hopeless legal appeals. Left with absolutely no other financial options, my parents were forced to put their pristine family home on the market. The massive house with the manicured lawn and the heated swimming pool, the fortress of conditional love where I had grown up feeling like a worthless outsider, was quickly sold at a massive loss just to pay for Penelope's towering legal debts. But the social fallout was even worse than the financial ruin. The elite country club immediately revoked their membership. Their wealthy, influential friends completely ostracized them, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a family publicly tied to a high-profile federal drug laundering scandal. Stripped of their wealth, their status, and their precious golden child, my parents ended up renting a tiny, rundown 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. Every time they walked down the cracked sidewalk of their dangerous new neighborhood, they were brutally reminded of the empire they had lost. They were left completely isolated, living in a cramped, miserable space filled with nothing but the bitter echoes of their own disastrous choices. The spectacular collapse of my parents' perfectly curated world was broadcast directly into the living rooms of every single person we knew. The federal indictment of a prominent downtown chief financial officer and his affluent country club wife was simply too sensational for the local news stations to ignore. For 2 entire weeks, Jamal and Penelope were the lead story on every evening broadcast. Their deeply unflattering county jail mugshots were plastered across the front pages of the city newspapers. The journalists aggressively dissected every single lurid detail of the criminal operation. They reported on the hidden Cayman Islands, shell companies, the luxury Gold Coast apartment, the secret child, and most damning of all, the illicit schedule 2 narcotics brought to a family housewarming party. The viral video Penelope had tearfully posted about surviving a toxic sister was ruthlessly mocked by internet commentators who pointed out the sheer psychopathic irony of her performance. The entire city knew exactly who the real monsters were, and suddenly the extended family members who had so eagerly participated in my public crucifixion experienced a profound collective awakening. The very same people who had aggressively blown up my smartphone with vicious text messages and hateful voicemails suddenly realized they had backed the spectacularly wrong horse. Aunt Martha, who had sent me that venomous paragraph accusing me of ruining a beautiful marriage, suddenly found herself profoundly embarrassed at her weekly bridge club. Cousin Jason, who had left a harsh voicemail calling me a psychotic, jealous freak, was suddenly humiliated when his coworkers asked if he was related to the notorious cartel money launderers on the television. Their frantic backpedaling began almost immediately. On a quiet Tuesday evening, I was sitting at my pristine marble kitchen island, reviewing some corporate audit files when my phone screen lit up. It was a long, rambling text message from Aunt Martha. "Oh, my dearest Madison," she wrote, her words dripping with a desperate, sickeningly sweet hypocrisy. "We are all just in absolute shock over the news. We had absolutely no idea Penelope and Jamal were involved in such dark, dangerous things. They manipulated all of us with their terrible lies. Please forgive us for misunderstanding the situation at your party. We are family, and we desperately need to stick together during these incredibly difficult times. Let me take you and sweet little Sophie out for a nice, expensive lunch this weekend." Less than an hour later, Cousin Jason chimed in with his own pathetic apology tour. He left a groveling voicemail, stammering awkwardly as he tried to walk back his previous insults. "Hey, Madison, it is Jason," he muttered nervously. "Listen, I am really sorry about the things I said last month. Your mom and dad were telling us crazy stories, and I just got caught up in the heat of the moment. You were totally right to protect your kid. Anyway, I know things are rough right now, but if you ever need a guy to help manage that trust fund, or just need someone to lean on, I am here for you. Give me a call back." I sat in my quiet, secure house and listened to the sheer, transparent greed in their voices. They did not actually feel genuine remorse for verbally abusing me or ostracizing me from the family tree. They were simply reading the new financial and social hierarchy. My parents were completely broke and living in a dangerous neighborhood. Penelope was serving a federal prison sentence. Jamal was locked away for a decade. I was the only successful person left standing in the entire bloodline. I had the $1 million home, the thriving career, and the absolute legal control of my grandfather's $3 million trust fund. They were crawling back to me because I was the new bank. I was the new source of social status. They expected me to gracefully accept their fake apologies and eagerly invite them back into my life because I was supposed to be desperate for their validation. I did not feel angry. I did not feel the sudden urge to type out a long, vindictive response outlining their massive hypocrisy. As a forensic accountant, I simply recognized them as terrible investments and permanently closed the ledger. I picked up my phone and logged into my cellular provider account. I did not block their individual numbers because that would still allow them to leave hidden voicemails. Instead, I permanently deactivated my phone number and requested a brand new unlisted one. I systematically locked down every single social media profile I had. I updated my home security system to actively flag their license plates if they ever dared to drive onto my street. I watched my old phone signal drop to 0 bars, severing the final digital tether to my toxic bloodline. For my entire life, I had mistakenly believed that closure meant forcing your abusers to look you in the eye and finally admit they were wrong. I thought winning meant extracting a sincere apology from the people who had actively tried to destroy my sanity. But sitting there in the peaceful silence of the beautiful home I had built entirely by myself, I experienced a profound paradigm shift. I finally understood the absolute truth. True power is not about fighting until you get an apology. True power is making them entirely irrelevant. Exactly 1 year passed since I made my biological family completely irrelevant. The seasons changed. The brutal Chicago winter melted into a vibrant spring, and the chaotic nightmare of that housewarming party faded into a distant, powerless memory. It was Thanksgiving Day, and my $1.2 million home was filled with a sound I had never once experienced during a childhood holiday: genuine, unfiltered laughter. I stood in my pristine kitchen, pulling a perfectly roasted turkey from the double oven. The rich, savory aroma of sage and melted butter filled the warm air. There was no suffocating tension hanging over the marble island. There were no passive-aggressive comments about my career choices. No heavy sighs of disappointment from a judgmental mother, and absolutely no need to walk on eggshells to accommodate a narcissistic sister. The toxic, suffocating fog that used to define my holidays was entirely gone, replaced by the bright, vibrant energy of my chosen family. I carried the heavy roasting pan into the formal dining room and set it in the center of the long oak table. The room looked absolutely beautiful, bathed in the soft golden glow of the late afternoon sun streaming through the large picture windows. Gathered around the table were the people who had actually proven their loyalty when my world was actively burning down. My fierce shark-like attorney David was sitting at the far end loudly debating a recent corporate tax loophole with Sarah, my brilliant senior audit manager. Two of my closest friends from college who had completely ignored the vicious viral smear campaign Penelope had launched against me were pouring generous glasses of expensive red wine and laughing until their sides hurt. But the most important person in the room was sitting right next to me. Sophie was 8 years old now, and she was absolutely thriving. She was wearing a bright yellow dress, her hair braided perfectly, entirely focused on drawing a picture on her paper placemat. She was completely safe. She was entirely unaware that exactly 1 year ago, a group of ruthless predators had actively conspired to drug her and steal her $3 million inheritance to pay off a violent drug syndicate. The massive trust fund grandfather had left her was securely locked down, compounding interest safely in a heavily fortified investment portfolio that nobody else could ever touch. I looked around the table, absorbing the profound peace of the moment. For 33 years, I had dreaded Thanksgiving. It had always been a highly orchestrated theatrical performance designed to worship Penelope. I remembered the sheer anxiety of sitting at my parents' cramped dining table, quietly listening to Jamal brag endlessly about his fake offshore investments, while my mother constantly criticized my clothing or my parenting. I remembered the visceral twisting knot in my stomach as I watched my family pretend to be perfect while harboring so much dark, toxic resentment. That miserable chapter was permanently closed. My parents were still sitting in their cramped, run-down apartment, on the outskirts of the city, likely eating a quiet, bitter meal completely alone. Penelope was eating off a metal tray in a federal prison cafeteria, serving her sentence for child endangerment and wire fraud. Jamal was locked in a maximum security facility, stripped of his custom suits and his arrogant swagger. They had gambled everything to destroy me, and they had lost absolutely everything in the process. I picked up my crystal wine glass and gently tapped the side with a silver spoon. The sharp, clear ringing sound easily cut through the joyful chatter. The table immediately quieted down, and everyone turned to look at me with warm, expectant smiles. Sophie looked up from her drawing, her bright eyes shining with innocent happiness. I want to take a quick moment to thank all of you for being here today. I began keeping my voice steady and completely full of gratitude. Family is not always defined by a shared bloodline or a shared last name. Sometimes the family you are born into is nothing more than a biological accident. True family is defined by the people who stand fiercely by your side when the truth is hard and the night is dark. You are my family. I raised my glass slightly higher, looking directly at the wonderful, loyal people who filled my beautiful home with light. We have all survived our own battles this past year, I continued, but today we are not looking backward. We are toasting to the absolute, undeniable power of the truth. We are toasting to the strength it takes to set hard, unforgiving boundaries against toxic people, no matter who they are. And we are toasting to the sheer, beautiful freedom of financial independence. The entire table raised their glasses in unison, their faces glowing with genuine affection and respect. I took a slow sip of the rich red wine, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of victory settle deep into my bones. I did not need to scream or fight or seek out petty vengeance against the people who had tried to ruin my life. I had already won the war. Because the ultimate, sweetest revenge you can ever achieve against toxic people is simply moving on and living a beautiful, incredibly successful life entirely without them. Madison's story powerfully illustrates that biological ties do not excuse toxic behavior. The most profound lesson here is the absolute necessity of setting firm, uncompromising boundaries to protect your peace and your loved ones. Often we feel obligated to tolerate abuse simply because it comes from family. However, this journey reminds us that true strength isn't found in enduring endless manipulation or waiting for apologies that will never arrive. It is found in walking away and building a beautiful, independent life without them. What is the hardest boundary you have ever had to set to protect your peace? Comment below.